All right. So get started here. Before we kind of get going, not quite as many people here as there were last Thursday. I wonder why, right? So the exams should be up there on Canvas. Should be able to see your score. So I think I have it displayed to you. Shows you what your percentage grade was. So it was scored out of 25 questions. There was 26. So if you got all 26 right, the highest you could possibly see is 26 out of 25, which would have been 104%. So like you could get above 100% technically on that exam. Just to kind of before we jump into material for today. Oh, I did some stuff. Looks like we've got what 80 and 82 was kind of the overall mean between this section and the other section. So that's generally about where I want to see the average, maybe a little bit higher even. I usually kind of try to target like a high C. So you guys kind of outperform that a little bit, kind of to that low B range. And that's also factoring in the fact that some people might miss the exam. And so that's currently kind of pulling that down a little bit. So overall, pretty good. It should be, we look at the assignments tab. So what's being counted towards your grade right now? So those first 4 quizzes are 15%. This is all matches up with the syllabus in terms of the weighting. Class participation, 4%. Module readings, 4%. We only have 1 pack-back assignment. I'll mention at the end of class today, I'll likely get the next one released. So it'll be kind of related to what we talk about this week. So you can kind of get started on it early. You should have everything you need to think material-wise, everything you would need after Thursday's class to really finish that second pack-back. But you'll see that pop up after class today. After my 2 sections. I usually kind of wait until after both sections are done. You've got that midterm kind of weighted 21.5%. So that's currently being factored towards your grade as well. Anything that's down here, right? This is just like, this was the one where I kind of had to scale it. This was a review module. Here's your CL points. None of that's currently being counted towards your grade in terms of what you see. Right? So we mentioned with those CL points, what do they do? At the very end, they'll simply get added to your grade. So if you have an 89%, and you got 1.5 total points from attending 6 CL sessions, each one worth 0.25%, you would have a, what did I say, an 89, it would become a 90.5, right? It just gets added in kind of to your final grade there. So I also kind of put up, and this will be a little bit more useful as we get closer to the final exam. We'll download this hypothetical grade tool. So what you can do is go to the grade book on Canvas, and you can kind of see what your scores were in each category. So I have this like hypothetical perfect score, right? Where there's 100 in every single category. The person went to every CL session. What would their final grade in the class be? Well, 100, and then you get that 3% at the end. So you actually could end up with 103% total. That's the highest possible grade you can get. Now, technically, that's not completely true, because what do I do on these exams? What grade did I just say you could have gotten on the midterm if you got every single question right? 104%, right? So there are some of these kind of little extra credit opportunities. I might throw an additional question on each of the next exams. I did that the first one. I'm likely going to do it on the next 2. So there's always kind of a little bit of wiggle room there in terms of your grade. I also put this hypothetical person. So I don't know. They study really hard for the quizzes. They go to the CL sessions. They just do the module readings, right? As long as you kind of get on, get those done, you can get really all the points there. You have 2 attempts at every question. Pack back, that's just a matter of getting it done. Quizzes, sorry, these are the in-class quizzes. This is you just show up and get most of the questions right. In-class quizzes, you don't do as well, and then you don't do as well in the midterm. You can start to play around with, okay, what if I did the exact same on the next 2 exams as I did on the first? So here I kind of put same grade, right? And this would be kind of what your total grade would be in the class if you keep performing at the same level on those exams. Now you can say, well, what if I did a little bit better as the class goes on? I do a little bit better on those exams. And then you can kind of play around with, okay, what if I did really well in the first midterm, but I don't know, I don't do as well in the next 2. And you can kind of play around with this hypothetical. Now, obviously, once we take the second midterm, there you just have to kind of change what that hypothetical final would be. You kind of see what your grade in the class would be. So this hypothetical grade tool, I'll kind of leave it up throughout the semester. At this point, we only have one of the exams in, so it's a little bit, you know, we're trying to project, even though there's still, each exam's what, 21.5% of the midterms, and the final I think I had is 26%. So I mean, there's still a lot of the grade out there. But as we get that second midterm in, this grade tool will be a lot more helpful towards the end of the semester, thinking about how much do I need to study for the final to get this grade in the class versus this grade. Okay. Is that clear what I'm, any questions on that before we keep moving here? No? So like I said, overall, really good. Like I said, low B as a mean there is kind of, you know, I guess technically, sorry, 80. So like a B minus, but that median was an 82. That kind of, you know, this isn't a stats class, but the median kind of accounts for the fact that there might have been some extremely low grades, people that like didn't take it yet, they count as a 0 still. Sorry, so yeah, missed the exam, kind of officially, unofficially dropped the class. Other than that, we'll kind of pick up this week. We're kind of combining 2 modules. So what was due at the end of the day today, we said, I posted a reminder, was that module 6 reading. We kind of skipped module 5 just to not cause any confusion. I didn't put it up on Canvas yet. After class today, I'll put it up there because now module 6 2 days passed. There won't be any confusion. You'll kind of have that to review. Now you could have reviewed that before today's class as well. It was up on Top Hat the whole time, but I didn't want to cause any confusion. Module 6 was the reading that we had to have done before today. Okay. Any other questions for me before we jump into this week's material? No questions? Are we sure? Now's the time to ask them. Okay. Excuse me. So I also did some stuff, and I'll probably bring in more of this next class. I don't know what everyone's stats background is, but like I kind of, there's this thing called linear regression. So you can like pick up what the relationship is between things. So I ran regression with CL attendance, and what was this one? Your score on the exam. So obviously, like we could get into the stats of this. This is like correlation versus causation, but there is a strong positive correlation between attending these CL sessions and performance on the exam. Right? For every session that someone attended, this essentially tells me that on average, their points on the exam were 2.3 points higher. So, I mean, maybe if you go to all 3, that would have been 6, 7 points. That's almost an entire, you know, getting close to a letter grade there, right? I can also see not only does it impact exam performance, it's impacting weekly quiz performance as well. There's still a strong positive correlation there. So once again, we won't dive into the statistics as to why, but these are statistics that support. I can't stress enough. I think these CL sessions are really worthwhile for you, right? And I've got data now to back that up. I have data from other semesters, but now I have data from you guys, right? Specific to you. Okay. You may not care about that completely, but I think that it's, I know, rather than just me telling you that, I now have some support for that. Those are beneficial. Okay. Any questions before we, let's see, dive into module 5, 6 material, which I've kind of combined those 2 modules. Really the stuff in module 5 we'll go through pretty quickly, and then we'll kind of start on module 6 stuff today, really focusing on that. No questions? Okay. Sometimes I get worried. Okay. All right. So where are we at? Did I hit record on this? Yes, I did. Okay, good. So we're going to start talking this week about social welfare. Thinking about something that sounds similar to something we've talked about called surplus, but it's used in a slightly different context. So it's not going to be a surplus in the number of units like we mentioned before. It's going to be slightly different. And then we're going to very quickly kind of move to thinking about how does government intervention impact this social welfare or impact efficiency. So allocated efficiency, we've already used this term. We said like with the PPC model, where was the allocated efficient quantity? Where the marginal benefit is equal to what? Marginal cost. The same thing going to be true. We're talking about any other scenario, any other market, right? So we said, okay, supply and demand, we're looking at the equilibrium price point of a market, how do we identify the equilibrium? It was where it was where demand was equal to supply, which what did the demand and supply curve represent to us? The marginal benefits and the marginal costs. It's the allocated efficient quantity. That's what the equilibrium point is. Okay. So we're going to think about if we're at this allocated efficient point. So allocate, when you allocate something, you're kind of like distributing or handing it out. So it should be the point at which the production in a market is maximizing kind of the total welfare or the total benefit we can think about to this society, right? Or to the people involved in that market. So if I think about consumer surplus, it's going to be the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs to consumers, right? So if I'm a consumer, what represents in a market my marginal benefit? I just said it. What's this downward sloping curve? Demand represents the consumer's marginal benefits. So if I'm telling you consumer surplus is going to be the difference between the marginal benefit of consuming something and the marginal cost, well, what is the marginal cost to consumers? When you buy something, what's the additional cost to you? It's not a trick question. If I go buy a gallon of gas, what's the marginal cost to me? However much a gallon of gas currently costs, right? The price. So for consumers, what is the marginal cost? It's the price. And then what would visually represent the consumer's marginal benefits? Demand. Now, we're talking about total consumer surplus. It's going to be the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs for every single unit that a consumer buys. So we can think about if I had this hypothetical equilibrium price, just for right now, we can kind of think about this would represent my consumer's marginal costs. Okay. Where would consumer surplus be? Well, for the very first unit, what's the difference between the marginal benefits, which is represented by the demand curve, and the marginal cost represented by price, kind of be right here. What about the second unit? Right here, third unit, fourth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now we know that past this point, why will we not go any further? For every unit past this point, what is true for the consumer? The marginal benefit is what relative to the marginal cost? It's lower than, so less than. So would I choose to buy that? No. We can kind of think about like my net benefit, the difference between my marginal benefits margin would be negative. Why would I do that? So consumer surplus, right? I kind of set it up like as a unit by unit, but really this graph, visually, we're going to think about the entire area under that curve is going to represent the surplus gain from every single unit purchased up to this point. Okay. So mathematically, the way we write this is like starting with the very first unit all the way to whatever that equilibrium quantity is. We're just adding up the difference between the demand curve and price, or said less technically, this is the way I'll usually reference it to you guys. Consumer surplus is the area above the price, but below the demand curve. That represents how much consumers are benefiting. Okay. So here we kind of have consumer surplus. Okay. Any questions on this idea? So I'm using this term of surplus. It's no longer like shortages or surplus in terms of the number of units. In economics, this word of surplus really just means like, well, what was the additional, right, benefit to consumers? Consumer surplus, what is the total or the additional benefit to consumers from all units purchased, right? And we would know the surplus gain from each unit would just be the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs, which are represented by our demand curve and the price the consumers pay. Any questions on this before I keep moving here? Okay. Now I'm going to jump the gun a little bit, but I think it's worthwhile at this point. If I'm thinking about instead of consumers, if I want to define producer surplus, well, it's going to be the difference between the marginal benefit and the marginal costs. But over here, this was the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers. Now you can kind of think about it's the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers. And we're now looking at the other side of things. So what represents the marginal cost to producers or suppliers? I said this a little bit earlier. In the market, demand represents marginal benefits. What represents marginal costs? Yeah. Our supply curve, right? That represented the marginal cost to our producers. Now, what's the marginal benefit if I'm selling something? If I've got something, I sell it, how much do I benefit by? However much I sell it for, which we would call the price, right? So whatever the equilibrium price in that market is, that's the marginal benefits to producers. So once again, this is the surplus gain from every unit. We're going to use this kind of math term, which is the summation, which just means add up across every unit purchased, the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs to producers. We said the marginal benefit is simply going to be kind of our equilibrium price. What represented the marginal costs? Our supply curve. So visually, where would producer surplus be? Well, it's the difference between the equilibrium price and our supply curve at every single unit. So it'll be represented by this kind of shaded area here. Whoops, not PC, PS, right? Producer surplus. Questions on anything I put up here? So whether we're talking about, and you can always run through the intuition yourself, right? Producer consumer surplus, it's just the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of whoever you're thinking about. The difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost of the consumers, well, their benefit was represented by the demand curve. Their costs, well, that was the price they had to pay. While for producers, the benefit is the price they get to sell the good for, and their marginal costs are represented by this supply curve. So if I were to kind of like stack these graphs on top of each other, right, it would look something like this, okay? So in any market, if I've got supply, I've got demand, the equilibrium price and quantity would be where supply is equal to demand. So once again, this is where this class isn't cumulative in the sense of the exams. I don't go back and ask you module 3 type questions, but I'm referencing things we talked about. You kind of need to know module 3 material, form material, in order to kind of understand where that equilibrium point is. So this is a non-technical way of remembering it, but if I identify where the equilibrium of a market is, where is consumer surplus? It's the difference between the demand curve and that equilibrium price, or it's always kind of my top triangle. That is the most, it's not a very technical way of saying it, but just as it's kind of easy visually, it's that top triangle. Where would producer surplus always be in this model? Well, it's going to be the difference between the benefit to producers, the price they charge, and their marginal cost. So for producer surplus, we're always going to be looking kind of at that bottom triangle. Okay. Any questions over anything there before I throw one more thing in? Okay. So if I don't care about producers or consumers, I don't care about where the surplus is coming from, how could I calculate total surplus here? Well, what represents the marginal benefits? And if I'm thinking about total surplus, this is like the surplus that exists in the entire market. I don't care if it comes from consumers or producers. It just has to be in the market. So what would the marginal benefits, if you think about it kind of from my market, be? And what would the marginal cost be? Well, the marginal benefits are represented by what? The demand curve. The marginal costs are represented by our supply curve. So where would total surplus be? Total surplus is just going to be the sum of producer and consumer surplus, right? We don't care where it's coming from. We just want to know what is the total surplus. So we would kind of take consumer and producer surplus, add them together. Visually, that would be, right, this entire larger triangle. Okay. Now, why do we know that we will never go past this equilibrium point? If we, let's say the market did decide, all of a sudden someone supplies this unit and somebody buys it. Well, what price could they come to an agreement on? Well, in order to sell it, what price would that supplier need? Something that was above their marginal cost. Okay, so they would need something up here. The consumer, they'd be willing to pay what? Up to whatever their marginal benefit is. So they would only pay a price somewhere down here. Is there any price that they would then both agree on? No, right? There's no overlap in this range of prices that the producers and consumers are okay with accepting. So that's why we would kind of stop here. Now, for all of these quantities, any price in the middle here would be kind of overlap, right? Consumers are willing to take a price below the demand curve. Producers are willing to accept a price above their supply curve. Every unit here, we will see producers and consumers agree to some type of interaction to where that good is produced and sold. But once we get to this equilibrium quantity, there's no price where they would both agree to kind of make that transaction with each other past that. So if I did, let's say that did happen, and I was like, oh yeah, this represents my total surplus. That's part of it. Well, actually, what would the value of this little triangle be? Total surplus is the marginal benefits in the market, represented by the demand curve, minus my marginal costs. What's true about every unit here? My marginal costs would be greater than my marginal benefits. So what would this surplus actually be? Negative. So if I go past that equilibrium quantity, what am I doing to total surplus? I would just be decreasing it. I'd be adding a negative value in there. So we say that where supply is equal to demand, if going past this point, all it's going to do is decrease total surplus. Well, notice every unit here, there was a positive difference. So I was increasing total surplus all the way up to this point. If I go past that point, I would just be adding negative values. I'd be decreasing it. So at that point where supply is equal to demand, what's true about total surplus? It's not negative, right? We're thinking about the total surplus. From all of these units, the surplus from each unit is positive. If I were to go past that point, it's negative. But the actual value of total surplus at this point would be maximized. That's the highest possible total surplus value we can see come from this market when we are at the allocatedly efficient point. We're allocating resources efficiently such that we've maximized total surplus for society. Right? So you can kind of think about total surplus representing this is the surplus that exists to everybody in this market. Right? It doesn't matter if you're a producer, consumer, you're involved in this market, we've maximized total surplus. Any questions there before? Because we're going to build on this, so I want to make sure we have a good base and probably spending a little more time than I even need to here. But so you'll notice if I have linear demand curves, how can I start to calculate producer, consumer, total surplus? They are the areas of this. How can I do it with my hand? They're the areas of what? Triangles. You guys take geometry, right? So we've got triangles. How do I find the area of a triangle? 1/2 times the base times the. We can calculate these surplus values, right? As long as we can identify these points, we can now calculate the area of these triangles or calculate producer, consumer, and total surplus. Okay. Any other questions before we keep moving here? All right, so I got time here. I kind of went through a lot of this, right? We already talked about consumer surplus. I drew that out for you. If I wanted to calculate it here, just to kind of put some numbers to it, what would the value of consumer surplus be in this market? Well, what's the height of my triangle? It's going from, well, the difference between my demand curve and the price is this blue shaded area. So the height is what, 140, so 60 times what is the base? Looks like it goes from 0 to 50, so 50 times 60, 3,000. That's my consumer surplus, right? What did I forget to do? This is the area of a triangle, so I then need to multiply it by still a half. So I've got consumer surplus here would be 1,500. Any questions over this? Like I said, hopefully this is a review in terms of like calculating the area of a triangle here. And I'm never going to give you anything other than these linear demand and supply curves. If I did, the math becomes more complicated. That would be like intermediate microeconomics. Okay. What if I had producer surplus? Well, we already talked about this is going to be the difference between the price, that's the marginal benefit to producers, and their marginal costs, which are represented by our supply curve. Okay. So if I wanted to calculate producer surplus, I had something like this. Well, my equilibrium price is 70. I know that producer surplus is the area in between the marginal benefits to producers. That's how much they're selling the good for. That's the price. And their marginal costs, which are represented by what? The supply curve. So the area in between the price and the supply curve represents my total producer surplus. So that'd be what? A height of my triangle goes from 20 to 70, so 50. And it goes out from what, 0 to looks like 50. So 50 times 50, 2,500. But once again, it's the area of a triangle. So we multiply then by 1/2, giving us that producer surplus of 1,250. Questions? Going through this a little bit quick, but I don't think this is terrible yet. I want to save some time for some stuff that's a little more, I think, complicated. Okay. Now, if I look at this old model, and then I look at, whoops, this one. Okay. If, let's assume these aren't the same price, but let's just assume we were looking at the same market, how would I find total surplus? If I knew consumer surplus, and I knew producer surplus, I would simply add them together, right? I'm done. That's easy, right? So that's not too bad. So the idea of consumer surplus, right, is that, well, yeah, the marginal benefit to me is a certain value, so I would pay anything that's below that. Because if the marginal benefit to me is what? 3,000, I'd pay anything up to that amount, right? So even though I paid 3,000, if I value it, or my marginal benefit is 4,000, I'm better off. And my marginal benefit is greater than my marginal cost, I'll gain some consumer surplus. Now, for the producer, we can kind of think about their marginal cost represents, this is the, excuse me, lowest possible price I would accept in order to supply this in the market. So maybe I would have supplied something in the market for 3,000 or so for 1,000. If the current price is 3,000, well, for sure I'm going to supply it then, right? I was willing to do it for 1,000. For sure, I'm going to be willing to do it for 3,000. This is the idea that we have producer and consumer surplus, as long as there's prices somewhere in between the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of our producer consumer. As soon as we get to that kind of right part where the marginal cost of the producer goes above the mark, now there's no prices where we come to an agreement. So that's kind of this idea of producer consumer surplus. It's the difference to both individuals between their marginal benefits and their marginal costs. And then we can think about for the market as a whole, it would be the sum of those two, producer plus consumer surplus. And then we'll add in a third party here in a second, which is the government. But for now, we just have the producers. If the government doesn't involve, the only people that we're concerned with in the market are the people supplying it and the people consuming it. Producers and consumers, those are the only two areas where surplus is coming from, or the only two parties where surplus is coming from. Okay. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay, so this is why I go combine these two. This is basically module 5. This is pretty quick, right? So what are some things that the government can do, right? That kind of screws with this. So I just said, when we get to this point where supply is equal to demand, we've maximized total surplus, right? This is the best point for the market to be at. But what can happen is the government can come in and do things like set what we call price floors, price ceilings, quotas. We can use taxes, subsidies. We've already kind of mentioned those a little bit before. We'll kind of do a deeper dive into them this week. All of them are going to potentially hurt or help consumers or producers. So some of these things might help one of the individuals, right? In fact, we'll look at some things. It can actually benefit both producers and consumers. The problem is we now have a third person to worry about, which is where does the government, for things like subsidies, get money from? People, right? So we're now going to also have some loss that comes from any type of government intervention. And we'll go through this, but this loss of surplus that's caused by the government meddling in these markets, the loss of total surplus is going to be what we call deadweight loss. So anytime the government gets involved and we see a decrease in total surplus, we're going to call that decrease in total surplus our deadweight loss. Okay. So if we don't have the government involved, we get to that equilibrium point, total surplus is maximized, we're at the allocated efficient point. Government steps in and meddles, moves us away from the allocated efficient point. We know that, well, we were previously where total surplus was maximized. When they get involved, we're going to end up at a point where we're not at the maximum point and total surplus is lower. How much lower is total surplus? We're going to call that our deadweight loss. So it's essentially the loss of surplus is like a less technical way of kind of mentioning it. Okay. All right. So that should set us up to then think about price ceilings. So usually, and all of these things are going to on their face maybe sound like good things. So price ceilings, the way I always think about this is if I've got a ceiling, I can't go any what? Higher, right? The ceiling prevents me from going any higher, right? So a price ceiling is going to prevent the price from going above a certain point, right? It's just like a physical ceiling. It's going to prevent that price from going any higher. So if I'm thinking about a market, and let's say here's the current supply and demand, and here would be my equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity if the government doesn't get involved at all. Okay. So we'll analyze a few things first. I won't kind of jump in too much. So first of all, what would total surplus be if the government doesn't get involved in this market? We said it would be the difference in between what? The marginal benefits of the consumers in that market and the marginal cost of the producers. So the area in between was essentially the supply and demand curve. So you can kind of think about here, this would represent total surplus before the government gets involved. So I'll call this kind of before. Now, if I'm going to, in the government, and I'm going to impose what we call an effective price ceiling. So I just said, if I set a price ceiling, that means I can't allow the price to go any higher. So let's say I look at this market, and I don't know, the current equilibrium price is 50, right? If the government comes in and tells everybody, you can't charge a price for this product any higher than 80. What do the people in this market say? Current price is 50. You're telling me I can't charge a price higher than 80. What do I tell you? I'm not. Okay, right? I'm going to keep charging 50. That's, you just basically imposed a regulation that makes no sense. I'm selling currently this good for $50. You tell me I can't sell it for more than 80. Okay, I'm not, right? So this is what we call an ineffective price ceiling, okay? An effective price ceiling is going to have to be what? Somewhere. So the current price is 50. What's the only way a law would kind of change that price, not allow people to charge a price of 50? If I set that price ceiling somewhere below the current equilibrium price. So if we're thinking about when do we have effective price ceilings, that's going to be if we set this price ceiling, it's going to have to be somewhere below whatever the current equilibrium price is. Because if it's set above it, people are just like, okay, I'm not charging a price that high, so nothing's going to change. So effective price ceilings would have to be set below the equilibrium price. Okay. Any questions on that idea? We're all okay with that? It's going to get harder, so make sure you're asking your questions early. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, if you're selling something for $50 and the government tells you you can't charge more than $100 for that, are you charging more than $100? No. So what happens? You keep selling it for $50. We would say that's an ineffective law or an ineffective price ceiling. If you're selling it for $50 and the government comes up and says, comes to your little roadside stand, I don't know, and says, you can't charge more than $20 for this product, you're price gouging. Well, can you keep selling it for $50? I mean, you can, but you might go to jail, right? This is an actual law, right? So the only way that price ceiling is effective is if I set it below what the current price is, right? What you're currently selling the product for. So effective price ceilings have to be set below whatever the current equilibrium price for that product is. Otherwise, doesn't have any impact on the market. People just keep going about their day. Does that make a little more sense? Okay. So what's going to happen here, right? So I'm going to kind of set this up. I could probably put this on the same graph. If you want to, you can, but gets to be a lot of moving parts. So I'm going to think about it this way. So let's say the government comes in and imposes this effective price ceiling. Okay. Well, let's think about how this is going to impact the market. For any quantity past this point now, if I sell this product, what is the marginal benefit to producers? When I sell something, the marginal benefit is the price I sell it for. Well, if I can't charge a price above this, for every single unit, I'm charging this price. What becomes true about every unit past this point? The marginal benefit to producers is now what? Relative to their marginal costs. This represents the marginal benefits to producers. What's true about the marginal benefits to producers relative to their marginal costs? They are. Is this line above or below this line? Below. So the marginal benefits are less than the marginal costs. So what's happening for every unit here? I'm losing surplus, right? The additional benefits aren't as high as the additional costs. I'm just going to be worse off. So what do you think producers do? Before, at the old equilibrium, they were out here. What do you think they now do? Every unit in this range is no longer, you can think of it for now as profitable. So will I produce anything past this point as a producer now? No. So you can kind of think about it as after the price ceiling, here's the new quantity in the market. What's happened compared to the old equilibrium quantity? After I impose this price ceiling, quantity has done what? So the old equilibrium was out here. What's happened after the price ceiling? Quantity has went down. So for every single unit that was being sold before, right, at the old equilibrium, we're no longer seeing any of these units supplied to the market. So if they're not supplied to the market, can consumers buy them? No. So what's the loss of surplus? Well, before, every single unit here, the total surplus, the difference between the demand and supply curve, was right here. But these units are no longer being supplied to the market. So all of this surplus is going to be a loss of surplus, or what we call deadweight loss. So if you have an effective price ceiling, it causes producers not want to supply as much to the market. They stop at a lower quantity, which means for all of these units, we're missing out on potential surplus compared to when we didn't have the price ceiling. Questions on this idea before we keep moving here? So if I have an effective price ceiling, what becomes true about some units before where that marginal benefit was above kind of that equilibrium price, so the marginal benefit was above the marginal cost, it's no longer true because the price is now lower, right? So there's going to be some units that used to be supplied and consumed in the market that no longer are. All of the total surplus that would have existed from those units being produced and sold in the market no longer exists because producers stop at this lower quantity. So with this effective price ceiling, we're going to have a loss of surplus. The surplus that we're losing out on, we're going to call that our deadweight loss. I'll use DWL to kind of notate that. Yeah. Underneath what? Here? Was that total surplus before? No, total surplus is just the area in between my supply and demand curve. So the only surplus loss will be the area that's in between my supply and demand curve. Yep.
Well, how come it's not the whole like shape? It's just that little time.
Like this shape over here. So this is what was lost, right? So what surplus still exists? Well, this many units, like these units are still being sold in the market. So these ones aren't. This is the only area. These are the only units where we are no longer seeing them sold. So for these units, what would consumer surplus be? Well, here's the new price. So before we even think about it, price ceilings, I said the only way they're effective is if we set them below the current equilibrium. So is that going to be a good or a bad thing for consumers? Price is lower. Is that a good thing for most of us when we're buying things? Yes, right? We would like that. So we can probably think about price ceilings are likely going to help consumers. So consumer surplus should go up, right? Or likely could go up. So where would consumer surplus be here? Well, once again, consumer surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits to consumers represented by the demand curve and their marginal costs. What was the marginal cost to the consumer? Well, it used to be the equilibrium price, but after the price ceiling, right, it's no longer a market in equilibrium. The new price is whatever price ceiling the government set. So where would my consumer surplus be here? It's the area in between my demand curve and the price that they're now paying up to the new number of units that we see be kind of like our equilibrium quantity after the price ceiling. So the original equilibrium quantity was way out here. After the price ceiling, we said producers aren't going to want to supply as much. We end up at this lower quantity. So the only surplus that consumers get, I can't buy something that isn't produced, right? So the difference between the demand curve and the price they pay, that represents consumer surplus, but only up to this new quantity, right? Nothing is being supplied past this quantity. So you can kind of see, if I had like this old equilibrium, consumer surplus used to be like this triangle. Well, notice we kind of lost out a little consumer surplus here, but we gained a large amount right here. So if I'm thinking about kind of relative to that equilibrium, consumers lost this little triangle, but they gained this larger rectangle. So with price ceilings, it's likely consumers are going to be better off. We're going to see consumer surplus potentially increasing there. Okay. Now, if consumers are better off, how do we then end up with deadweight loss? How does total surplus go down? Well, who makes up total surplus? Consumers and producers. So before we even go through it, if we know total surplus is lower and consumer surplus went up, what has to happen to producer surplus? The total is lower, and we got producer and consumer. I'm adding those up, and now the total is smaller. But I know consumer is higher. It has to be that producer surplus is a lot lower, right? So now for all these units that are being produced and sold in the market, what's the producer surplus? Well, that's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of producers. What are those? Well, the marginal benefits would simply be this new price that the government set. What's the marginal cost represented by the supply curve? So the area in between that price and the supply curve would be here. So here's kind of my producer surplus. Where would have producer surplus been before? This entire triangle. So you can kind of see, oh, we lost. It used to be that producer surplus was this entire area. It's now this much smaller area. Part of what used to be producer surplus is just gone. It's part of deadweight loss. The other part of what used to be producer surplus has now been transferred over to consumers. So when we have a price ceiling, we're lowering prices. That's going to be a good thing for consumers. So who's going to be better off? Consumers. We're lowering prices. Who's going to be worse off? Who is that bad for? Producers or suppliers, people selling that good. Okay? And we can kind of visually see that here. And if I had numbers, we could actually calculate what these values are, which I think I've got in the slides here in a second. Okay. But before we kind of go back, any questions on anything I said or anything I did here? All right, where are we at on time? Okay. So I'll go through this quick and we'll kind of do that. So just some examples so that I'm not just talking in generalities as much. But a lot of times we see rent controls, right, in large cities. If the current equilibrium price of an apartment in Bloomington is $4,000 a month, Bloomington's gonna be like, yeah, students can't afford to live here. We need to step in and kind of impose this price ceiling, right? Lower the price for those consumers. You see a lot of times different industries will try to be protected by the government. So aluminum, steel, sometimes during times of war, I don't know. I think they probably just use war as an excuse to kind of help out those industries, but I'm a bit of a cynic, right? So you have all these, different, a lot of different examples we've seen where the government comes in, sets price controls or sets price ceilings. They don't allow for the price of certain products to get too high. What might be a good right now that would be a very good political move to come in and put a price ceiling on? It's like in all the news, you eat it for breakfast, eggs, right? Like it's a staple of a lot of diets. The price is skyrocketed. So what might it make sense politically for me to do? Come in and impose a price ceiling. But if I impose a price ceiling, that is going to benefit my consumers, right? We said, what's going to happen to consumer surplus? It could increase. But what's going to happen to the producers in that egg market? Producer surplus is going to be, instead of this entire area, much smaller. Right? So these price ceilings are going to hurt producers, help consumers. If I'm a politician, I mean, probably depends on if it's election season. If it's election season, who do I maybe care about a little bit more? Who votes? Mostly consumers. If it's not in the election season and I'm just getting money from special interest groups, who do I maybe care about a little bit more? The producers. Maybe I'm not as likely to impose price ceilings, right? Maybe a good project to kind of look and see if the imposition of price ceiling is actually correlated with that. I've never actually looked into it. I have good thoughts occasionally. So this is just another visual of it, and then I kind of want to jump to kind of give you guys some practice. So let's say I have producer and consumer surplus here, right? This market's in equilibrium. Supply is equal to demand. I can identify that equilibrium price and quantity. Consumer surplus, once again, area between the equilibrium price and demand curve, or the triangle on top. Producer surplus, the area between the price and the supply curve, or that triangle on the bottom. After we have this price ceiling imposed, where is the new equilibrium quantity? Well, now, if I can't charge a price above 800, all of the apartments past 1.8, I think this is in millions, the marginal cost is now higher than the marginal benefit to me, or the price I can charge as a producer. So I'm no longer going to want to supply any of these to the market. So what's my new quantity I see after the price ceiling? It's going to be lower. Where is my new producer and consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus, area between the demand curve and the new lower price they pay, right? So consumers are going to be better off. Producers, difference between their marginal benefit, the price they can charge at 800 now, and their marginal cost of supply curve is going to be much lower. And I kind of tried to highlight this in my drawing, but you can kind of see here visually, part of what used to be producer surplus has now been transferred over to consumers. So price ceilings will transfer some of what used to be benefits to producers and basically push it off to now be benefits to consumers. Politically, this can sometimes be a very good move, right? Evil companies, I help the people. kind of thing, right? But even if I've done that, what have I inherently am I always going to do with price ceilings? Even though I might help some consumers, what's going to be true about all those apartments past 1.8 million? They're no longer existing on the market. So I've got a loss of surplus in this market, right? And yes, some of it was producer surplus, right? And yes, some of it was consumer, but the consumer benefited a little bit more than what they lost. So like consumers are better off. The problem is, yeah, if I have an apartment here, what happened to my consumer surplus? Well, it used to be between the demand curve and 1,000. Now it's between the demand curve and 800. Okay, if I keep my apartment, my consumer surplus went up. Right? I'm paying a lower price. What about these 0.2 million people? What are they doing now? They used to have an apartment to live in. Now they don't. Right? So these price ceilings, if we were thinking about like rental price ceilings, yeah, they benefit whoever gets to keep an apartment. But what's going to happen to some people? I don't have a place to live. I'm now unhoused, whatever we're calling it these days, right? I might have to move out of the city, commute in, right? There isn't going to be enough supply in these inner cities if I use these rental price ceilings, okay? So sounds good, right? And yeah, if you keep your apartment here, you love price ceilings. A lot of people who don't have an apartment anymore, I don't have a place to live. I would argue they don't think these price ceilings are a very good thing, right? So that's kind of the idea of a price ceiling. Just to kind of recap some of what we've talked about. So they have to be set at a price that's below the current equilibrium in order for them to be effective. Excuse me. They're going to cause shortages. So we didn't quite go through this, but we can think about if I've got this price ceiling. Actually, I'll draw a quick graph for us out here. I said that not right at all. I will draw a graph real quick for us here. So let's say I had this supply and demand, and then impose kind of this price ceiling. What's my new at this lower price? What's the new quantity supplied? Wherever I'm at on my supply curve. What's my quantity demanded? Wherever I'm at on my demand curve. So we use this term of surplus so far today to kind of represent like, you know, the benefit, the total difference between marginal benefits and marginal cost. We still have surplus and shortages in units. What would I have here? If the quantity demanded at this new lower price is above the quantity supplied, I would have a shortage in the number of units, right? So anytime we see these price ceilings imposed and they're effective, they're going to cause a shortage in that market. Once again, a shortage in the housing market or the rental, the apartment market is not a good thing. Okay. And then the only other thing I think I didn't mention here. So we won't really talk too much about black markets today. But no, if I artificially am causing that price to be too low, what's going to be true? Well, there's still people who are out there willing to pay a higher price, right? It's just they can't do it legally. So what might they do? Do it illegally, right? And pay that higher price, just not in a legal market. Right? So we'll talk a little bit more about this, and we can talk about taxes and things like that next class. Now, an ineffective price ceiling, I kind of already mentioned this. If I ever set a price ceiling above the current equilibrium, what's going to happen? We said nothing, right? So we don't really have to worry about that, right? The government was just being inefficient. They didn't correctly identify what the equilibrium price in that market was going to be. Okay. In fact, well, yeah. What else do I want to say here? Let me see. Yeah, I want to go here. We'll come back to this if we have time. I want to make sure we kind of go through this. So there we go. So let's say I had something that looked like this, and I had what is consumer? Well, let's do a little bit of flip class. Instead of me working through one of these, I'm going to see if you guys can work through some of this before we even talk about it, and then we'll kind of rehash it. So I'm going to get this in-class quiz popped up here. And I want you guys to kind of work on this. I'm not going to walk through them with you today. So I'll give you kind of the next 10 minutes here, right? So there's a couple questions. I think there's 4 questions in here. Each one, I think I have set, as long as you respond to it, you'll get half the credit. You get it right, you'll get the other half. Okay. So talk with the people around you, kind of think about what we've talked about up to this point. It's going to ask you questions like, okay, before and after these price ceilings, right? Actually, hold on. There's a question on there that we haven't covered yet. So I'll go through that one with you guys here real quick. So I'll give you guys 10 minutes. I'll then give you the answer to the ones that we haven't covered. Well, here, let me see. I just remembered, I think there's a price floor one. We've only talked about price ceilings. So I want to make sure that I'm fair to you guys. Okay. So this will be good. So you guys actually, I'll give you a little bit less time. It's going to have you guys do the first 2. And then we'll work through the last 2 together. I'll kind of introduce the next topic. So I'll give you guys till 9:05, right? To kind of work on this quiz, talk to the people around you, and then we'll kind of finish up, do the last 2 questions together. Yep. Huh? I'll change it here as you guys start working on it. Yep. All right. So keep going on that. Like I said, I'll give you another next 7 minutes. I won't go over those 2 until after I close the quiz, but I will go over the last 2 with you guys. Okay. Like I said, talk to the people around you, try to figure it out. Maybe they understand part of what you know. You don't understand maybe part of what they know. And if you get done and want to work on the last 2, we'll kind of go through them together, but go through a little bit quicker. Might get out of here a little bit sooner if I've got some people to respond to me when I'm asking questions. All right. So it looks like people are working. Sometimes I just talk a big game. So maybe we'll go through all these, right? Change be due by 9:15. So if I have a price ceiling here, I even drew it up in this market. So the current equilibrium price without a price ceiling would be what in this market? Can't identify an equilibrium price. I saw the exam scores. I know many of them can't. What's the equilibrium price and quantity without the price ceiling? Where supply is equal to? How do you identify an equilibrium? Where supply is equal to demand. What price is that at? 50, right? So an effective price ceiling would have to be set what? Above or below that value? Below. So we've got an effective price ceiling here. So consumer surplus after this price ceiling, right? Now, one thing you could do, right, is think about, well, what is consumer surplus before? So here, if I didn't have this price ceiling, how would I identify consumer surplus? It would be the area above the equilibrium price, but below the demand curve. So it would be this kind of upper triangle. So that would be what? 40 times a half, so 800. So what should happen to consumer surplus if we have this price ceiling? So consumer surplus before was 800. After the price ceiling, it should be. So what's the new price after I impose this price ceiling? No longer 50. I'm telling you, you can't charge a price above 30. So the lower price is going to be a good or a bad thing for consumers. Generally good. Okay? But it doesn't necessarily mean that consumers are going to see an increase in surplus. Because you can imagine, what if I lowered this all the way down to 0? Well, if I lower this all the way down to 0, what do I know consumer surplus is going to be? It's kind of a tricky question. If the price is 0, how much gets supplied to the market? So what can consumers buy? Nothing. So what's their consumer surplus? 0, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be that consumer surplus goes up, right? They actually can also not be benefited really from this price ceiling. Now, the ones that buy the good, they benefit, but as I lower this price, what do we say is true? What's happening to the equilibrium quantity in the market? It's no longer 40. After this price ceiling, what would the equilibrium quantity be? 20. So yeah, for the people that get to buy the good, they might be better off with this lower price. But what's going to be true? 40 people can no longer buy that good, right? So we're going to be losing a lot of surplus from the fact that as I lower the price, some of these goods are just going away. So what is the consumer surplus after this price ceiling? Will it be the area in between my demand curve, consumers' marginal benefits, and the price of the good? So I now have what? The area of a triangle and the area of a rectangle. I'm not going to be doing anything crazy here. So how do I find the area of this rectangle? Length, or whatever you call it, length times width, base times height. So I have what? 40 times 20. So the area of that rectangle would be 800. What's the area of the little triangle? 20 times a half, so 200. So I would then add those together. What's the total area underneath the demand curve but above my price? 1,000. So all we're doing there is we're identifying consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve, but above this new price that's being set, but only up to this new quantity, right? We know that now that the price is lower, no quantity past 20. Now for the producer, the marginal benefit is below the marginal cost. We won't see them produce anything past this quantity of 20. We'll see a reduction in the quantity of that market. So consumers here, they went from what? 800 consumer surplus before to now we said they have 1,000. So were they better off? Not a trick question. I went from having a total, like, you can think of surplus to consumers and producers being like their total net benefit. So if my total net benefit was 800, now it's 1,000, am I better off? Yeah, right? Now, what happened to producers here? Actually, what's the second question? Yeah, I didn't even ask you for the value. But let's say we have the same thing, and now I want to know, same price ceiling, what happens to producer surplus, and what happens to deadweight loss? Well, first of all, as long as we have an effective price ceiling, and we'll talk a little bit before we get in class of price floors, as long as it's effective and it changes
the equilibrium. The equilibrium represented where total surplus was maximized. So if I've moved away from that point, what has to happen to total surplus? Has to go down. So if I have an effective price ceiling, what's going to be true about total surplus? It has to be lower, which means I will have deadweight loss. So deadweight loss would actually be going up, right? My losses of surplus are increasing. Now, what's going to happen to producer surplus? What was it before? Well, the old equilibrium price was 50. That was the marginal benefit to producers, the marginal cost, the supply curve. This triangle would represent producer surplus. So it'd be what? 40 times 40 times a half. Started out the same as consumer surplus, 800. After this price thing, though, what is producer surplus now? Well, what's the price they can now sell the good for? It's only going to be 30. The difference between that and their supply curve, it's what, 20 times a half? Producer surplus has fallen all the way down to 200. So think about it, don't get too lost in like calculating here. When I'm asking you for directional changes like this question, if I have an effective price ceiling and it lowers the price, who's that going to benefit? Consumers. Who's that going to hurt? Producers, right? So we would expect producers are going to see a decrease in surplus and that we now have some deadweight loss that exists, right? So producer surplus is going down, but deadweight loss is going from nothing to now existing, so it's going up, right? Increasing. Any questions on those before we keep moving here? Okay. What do I have here? So we didn't talk about price floors. I'll give you these answers just for the sake if we have time. I'll kind of go through them, but just to make sure everyone can kind of get this submitted. So this one should be what? 400. And then number 4 should be that they both remain the same. So I'm going to go through these. I just want to make sure I give you the answers, make sure you can kind of get that submitted before 9:15. So we've talked about price ceilings, right? So what's going to be going on with price floors, right? So if I've got a market and here's the current equilibrium price, where would an effective price floor be? So if a price ceiling doesn't allow the price to go any higher than this, a price floor isn't going to let the price go any lower, right? So if the current price is 50 and I come in and I say, okay, look, you can't charge a price. So let's say I try to impose a price floor. And I say, you can't charge a price any lower than 30. What do the people in this market tell me? Okay, I'm not, right? So a price floor, unlike a price ceiling, which it had to be set below the equilibrium price, the only way a price floor has any impact is if it's set above our equilibrium price. Okay, so it's the exact opposite of a price ceiling. So an effective price floor has to be set above that equilibrium price, which is why in question 4, when I gave you a hypothetical price floor and it was set below the current equilibrium, what happens? Nothing. Everything remained the same. Now, if I impose an effective price floor, what's going to be true? Well, now if I think about what does the price represent to my consumers? So if I'm thinking about consumer surplus, what does price represent to consumers? Their marginal costs. Demand represented their marginal benefits. So if I think about, if I can't charge a price below this, right? For every unit here, the marginal benefit to consumers is now less than the price they pay. So what's going to be true about consumer surplus for all these units? It would be negative if they chose to buy it. So where do consumers stop? At this new lower quantity. So it doesn't matter if we have a price ceiling, price floor, what's going to happen to the new quantity we see in the market? It's going to be lower, right? Now, when we had a price ceiling, that came from the fact that producers weren't supplying as much to the market. Price floors, that's going to come from that consumers aren't willing to buy as much in the market. Similar kind of idea. Okay, if this is the new quantity, where's the total surplus I lost out on?
Well, what would have been total surplus without the price floor? The difference between our supply and demand curve. So all of these units that we're no longer seeing, so this was like the old equilibrium, all these units we're no longer seeing consumed and produced in the market, that's all gone. That surplus is all lost. So that is our deadweight loss. Now, once again, intuitively, if prices, so this is where it gets kind of be counterintuitive, a price floor actually does what to the price? Raises it. So if the price is higher after a price floor, what do you think is going to happen to producer and consumer surplus? If prices are higher, is that going to benefit consumers? So we're going to see consumer surplus likely goes down. Kind of think about where would consumer surplus be? The area in between this new price they're paying and the demand curve. So yeah, much smaller. And then what's going to happen to producer surplus? Well, higher prices, potentially it could improve producer surplus. We'll actually talk about an example next class. It also could decrease. Same kind of idea as we talked about the price ceilings. If I impose a price floor too high, what happens? Nobody is going to be willing to buy it. So what happens to total surplus? It would go to zero. The market doesn't exist. So in that case, producer surplus would definitely go down, right? So these higher prices have the potential to help producers, but not necessarily. So we'll go through price floors pretty quick at the beginning of next class because we have almost all the tools that we needed talking about price ceilings. We'll then talk about taxes, subsidies. If you want to see your exam or go through it, I'll have office hours tomorrow. So obviously I'm not bringing them here with me. You can stop by, we can kind of look at your exam. Other than that, I'll see you guys on Thursday. Yep, have a good one.